Any questions pertaining to the transplants? There's so much that one could add to that. I had forgotten that when I told you about my my great nephew, who they really expected to die, being found at the last moment to be alive, it actually was my own sister who rescued him. Because what happened is they had evidently made up their mind to pull the wires out and everything, and she just had walked around to the bottom of his bed crying, in essence saying goodbye to him. And she was looking down, and she saw a tiny movement in the sheet and thought it might be just because of the tears in her eyes. So she reached down and lifted the sheet up to expose his bare feet, and that's when she actually saw a toe move. So she actually saved him, and that's how close it came.
Question. Is it fair to assume that the soul is present in the body until the very last cell is dead?
I don't know. I'm not sure I'd want to say that. But on the other hand, we have to remember that the soul animates the entire body from tip to toe, and therefore it isn't good enough to say part of it's dead. You have to think in terms of the unified whole, which hylomorphism teaches. And the point is always to remember that the presumption has to be in favor of life. You can't guess, you can't presume that somebody's dead and then proceed, because the moral principle is that you cannot directly take an innocent human life. So it's a certain end. It's a sure ordinance that must be obeyed. You must therefore take the morally safer means to fulfill that obligation to respect the life. So it isn't good enough to just say it's a crapshoot. It isn't good enough to say it's highly improbable. You have to have moral certitude that this person is actually really truly dead. And the difficulty, as I said, really, it isn't so much a problem with transplants, it's a question of when can we bury you? Because as far as the transplants are concerned, they want the patient so close to being alive that they're alive. And that's the problem. By the time you are really very quite certain the person is dead, the transplant team no longer has any interest. And as one medical personnel mentioned to me a few days ago, they refer to the transplant teams in the hospital as the ghouls, which kind of says it all. Except the ghouls, if I remember right, only eat the dead. So I guess they don't quite fulfill the definition. Anything else on transplants?
Not on transplant. Can we assume that the soul is there at the moment of conception?
I wouldn't say it's an assumption. I would say all available evidence that we have from natural science and from hylomorphic doctrine and philosophy affirms that the soul is there from the point of conception. Of course, the big move, as you realize, which the American gynecologists and obstetricians did about 1966, was to redefine the beginning of life to be the moment of implantation rather than the moment of conception, because they knew only too well that most of the artificial birth control methods that were in use operate by preventing implantation, not by preventing conception, and therefore are actually abortifacient. So if you can redefine the beginning of life to the moment of implantation rather than conception, you avoid the evident implication of homicide. Of course, the problem is that implantation is just a matter of where the embryonic human being is living, not whether it is an embryonic human being. Okay, anything else on transplants? Tonight, we're going to deal with the question of truth and lying. First of all, it has been said that everybody lies. Everybody tells lies. In fact, so much so that we distinguish between little white lies and big black lies. We all know, it is said, that there are times when you simply have to tell a lie, when it would be just morally horrible not to tell a lie. And that there are sometimes, in order to retain state secrets or for the military to engage in appropriate spying, it is necessary to lie. And after all, what are we talking about but things that are perhaps so innocent as telling little children about Santa Claus? And surely nobody would want to say that that's an evil thing to do. So, faced with a kind of universality of the fact of lying, how do we work out a theory of truth? And indeed, why shouldn't we lie? Now, of course, I'm not going to tell you that it's all right to lie. I presume you knew that, or you'd be having your hands all up in my face at what I just said, right? But how do we handle the complexity of everyday living in which it seems that people do tell lies all the time? In order to understand this, we have to understand what is meant by truth and what is meant by telling the truth and why we are supposed to tell the truth. Because after all, it's hard to understand counterfeit money if you don't know what real money is. And you understand lies only because you first understand what it is to tell the truth. Truth is one of the metaphysical transcendentals, isn't it? It's the relationship between the mind and being. It's the intellect apprehending the thing as it is. It's the mind conforming itself to being. And we have at least three different kinds of truth that we normally speak about. One is the ontological truth, which is the conformity of the object to the mind. For example, if we say somebody is a true patriot, we are measuring how that person is as compared to our understanding of what patriotism truly entails. We say this man is a living saint. We are comparing how he is actually living to the concept of sanctity, understanding ultimately that the foundation for all these essences rests in the mind of God. We also have what's called the logical truth. I'm not quite sure why they call it the logical truth, but it means the conformity of the mind to the thing. And hence, if I say there's a telephone over there, and there is a telephone over there, I have spoken the logical truth. The measure of truth in that case is not the mind, but the thing. If I say that it is a telephone and it is a telephone, the truth of my statement is measured by the fact that it is a telephone. And then finally, we have the one we're interested in tonight, the moral truth. Moral truth entails a relationship, again, a comparison, between the outward expression of the mind and the content of the mind itself. So it really is a matter of, am I saying to you that which I am actually understanding? That's the basic concept of moral truth. And of course, that allows the possibility that what I'm saying to you does not correspond to what I am understanding. And if it does not so correspond, then at least what I'm saying is false in relation to my understanding, and it may indeed be what we call a lie, which would be morally wrong. Now, why it's morally wrong, we'll shortly see. Higgins tells us that Grotius and Pufendorf, I love that name, measure the notion of truth and lying and falsehood in terms of whether the hearer has a right to know the truth. They allow that a lie would occur if the hearer has a right to the truth and you deny him that right. But if the hearer has no right to the truth and you tell him what is not true, you have not spoken a lie, but merely uttered a falsehood. So basically, if you don't have the right to know what I know, I can tell you anything I want, according to Pufendorf and Grotius. Now, of course, that's a little bit scandalous. One of the obvious difficulties with that is it would then seem that where you have one authority superior to another, that authority has no obligation to tell the inferior the truth. Therefore, God could lie to us at will. Parents could lie to their children at will, and there would be no error or sin entailed. Obviously, that's not satisfactory. What we mean by a lie is speech which is contrary to the mind. Now, this gets a little bit complex the further we go into it. But what we are talking about is serious speech where I am appearing to try to tell you what is absolutely in my mind, and in fact, I don't. Because because the point is that when we talk about truth and falsity, we're talking about intellects. We're talking about persons. We're talking about beings with minds. And the mind apprehends the truth. It is the operation of the intellect to grasp the truth. But minds do not live in isolation. We communicate one person to another. And when we communicate, what we are supposed to be expressing is that which is in the mind. That is the natural order of communication. That's what communication is all about. So we do have a difficulty, even when you're talking about telling little children about Santa Claus. Because actually, this is so much at the edge that I have read 2 ethics textbooks. One of them said that telling your kids about Santa Claus was okay, and the other one said it wasn't. I mean, that's about as close as you get to splitting the difference. But the difficulty, I know, it's, sister, you look like I'm...
Well, because I'm thinking of the word fairy tales.
Yes.
And children read things that are not true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But there's nothing there that is intended for final deceit.
No, and the children know it. But when you tell them about Santa Claus, many parents are really trying to tell the kids this is what it is. And they will go to great lengths, how to put it, to deceive the children for a long time, until they find out some horrible way and come home and say, Mommy, is it really true?
You have to keep the Santa Claus wrapping paper.
Don't break my heart. The difficulty, though, is if you do that with children, what they come to realize is that their parents have really lied to them for years and years and years and told them about this mythical being that isn't really there. And there is a downside to it, because what if you're also teaching them about your religion? What if you're teaching them that Christ died and rose from the dead? And you just told them that they can't believe you when you tell them Santa Claus came down the chimney. And they're supposed to believe you that somebody rose from the dead? See? Got to be a little bit careful about the law of unintended consequences here. You might get more than you bargained for. Usually it's harmless, because somehow the blessed little ones manage to sort it out in their mind that it isn't the same sort of thing. But of course, we have reasons why we don't approve of lying. There is, first of all, what we call the extrinsic evil of lying, namely, and that which Kant as well saw, that if you allowed that people could lie, you basically destroy all social relations. I mean, after all, I was just thinking the other day, if you speak a language, let's say just one language, what good would it do if there was nobody else in the world who spoke that language? Who would you be talking to? Yourself. And probably to what end? Over time, it would probably degrade. The whole point of language is to communicate to another, to use words, arbitrarily chosen words, that convey the concept of the concept in one mind to the concept of the person, the hearer. You're not conveying images, you're conveying concepts, you're conveying meanings. That's why when I get done talking to you, I don't say, did you get my words? I say, did you get my meaning? I don't say, did you get my imagery? I say, did you get my meaning? Do you understand what I said? So language is a means of communicating. There are other ways one could communicate, but this, of course, is the most common one. So we would say that you shouldn't lie because it would destroy the very fabric of society. The difficulty is we have people like, believe it or not, Plato, and indeed most people would say sometimes we have to lie. We just have to lie. There is an enormous amount of misunderstanding on this topic. I mean, in a sense, it's not as horrific a topic as those dealing with life and death and procreation. But it's one where there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding. And as I say, most people say, well, everybody lies. So what's wrong with it? On the intrinsic level, here is the real reason why you can't lie. It constitutes a perversion of the faculty of communication. As human beings, indeed, any persons, I would apply to angels and God too, have the ability to communicate. We do it, of course, by spoken language. But we could do it other ways. I mean, other kinds of signs. We do it by Morse code. we can do it by sophomore signals. Indians are doing it by smoke signals. Doesn't matter. It's all a kind of language. The difficulty is that even for God, communication is an expression of the divine being. And were God to express his being and yet at the same time contradict the very essence of that being, I mean, obviously God couldn't do that. What a lie really is, if you think about it, it's an act of communicating what is in your mind in such a way that the person hearing cannot possibly know what is in your mind, and in fact comes to know something other than what is in your mind. Now, what is this? In simplest terms, this is an anti-communicative communication. It's an anti-communicative communication. It is a contradiction in being. It's a contradiction in terms. It is to use the faculty of communication in such a way as to contradict the very purpose for which it exists. That's what makes it wrong. It is a perversion of the operation of our nature. It isn't the most serious one you can make. It doesn't mean that it's a grave moral evil every time it's done, but it is certainly by its nature immoral. Its gravity is measured by the gravity of the lie, as I'm sure you realize. So yes, there are little white lies, but they're at least gray. They're not fully white. They're not good, and in fact, they're morally evil. I don't mean to suggest they're neutral. They're evil, but a little white lie may not be a serious evil. In other words, it may not be a mortal sin, but it is a venial sin, not thereby to be underestimated, which then raises the horrific question of how are we supposed to understand the examples I gave you at the beginning about the fact that everybody lies. As a matter of fact, under the heading of lying is cheating, when students cheat on a test. In many cases, what they're doing is representing, or cheating on term papers, which I'm more familiar with even, they're representing as their work that which is not their work, so they're actually lying. They are communicating to the professor, this is what I have done, when in fact it is not what they have done. I must confess it's one of the reasons I retired. I got sick of trying to figure out which ones were the little liars and which ones weren't. And it is, I found it agonizing to know with certitude that when you correct 100 papers, in some cases you have given good marks to a liar, a cheater, and in some cases you have been very suspicious of somebody who may be completely innocent. Many times I would look at a paper, and when it was really badly done, I'd breathe a sigh of relief, because I know all I had to do was mark it. I didn't have to worry about whether it was a cheat, because if at least this one was an honest try in all likelihood. But how are we to make sense of the way that we use speech? When it seems, people say everybody lies. You're walking down the street and somebody says, how are you? You say, I'm fine. And actually you're not fine at all. What have you done? A modern philosopher whom I found very helpful in this regard is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is the author of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, written in 1922, in which he expresses a very basic form of linguistic, positivistic thought, in which he says language mirrors reality. They were trying to work out a absolute step-by-step, we have a perfect language, perfectly mirrors reality, and if you get it worked out perfectly, all your philosophical problems will disappear. Wittgenstein is very interesting because shortly after his death, another book by him was published in 1951 entitled Philosophical Investigations. And he's perhaps one of the few philosophers I've ever heard who came right out and contradicted what he had previously written. In fact, he starts out by describing exactly what he said in the Tractatus and proceeds to tell us that it's wrong. He said some people would say that language mirrors reality, and it just doesn't. In fact, I believe he says, contrary to that which we ourselves once believed, and then proceeds to lambaste himself. Because he is talking about the way in which we use language, and he describes it in terms of what he calls Sprachspielen, language games. Language games. Language is not a one-to-one correlation between the expression and reality. We all engage in language games when we are speaking, and we become better at it the longer we live. So, are you really lying when you're walking down the street and somebody says to you, how are you today? And you say, fine, and go on. And would you really expect, if you're walking down the street and you ask somebody how they are and they stop you and say, I got a little cold, and I had a headache this morning, and when I went to brush my teeth, I found out I had a bad tooth, and my brother-in-law is treating me terribly. I mean, is that what you really expect when you ask somebody today, how are you? In most cases, it's simply a greeting. That's all. And you're not expected to tell the truth, or you're not expected to tell that truth. It is understood. I mean, perhaps if life were absolutely horrible and you ask them, how are they today, they might say, I just found out my mother died. I mean, okay, that understandably, that would break the game. But understandably, why it would break the game. But when we communicate one to another, there are layers of understood expressions that are not always to be taken literally. And the point is, we all know it. We understand that when we speak. So the traditional example of mental reservation is when the salesman comes to the door and little Johnny answers, and the salesman said, is your mother home? And Johnny says no, and of course according to mental reservation it's because it means no, he's not home to you. You don't even have to go that far. Wittgenstein would say the salesman understands, no just means forget it. Doesn't tell you anything about who's home, it just means you're not going to make a sale. And that's fine. Nobody's lied to anybody. And we simply have to understand that there are many ways in which we speak where there is a common convenience between the speaker and the hearer that is not a matter of telling the truth or lying. It's just the way that we operate within society in the normal congenial modes of expression. And that's all that it means. Even when you're in a court of law, if someone says that you are to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, makes you swear to do that, there is already an understanding there. Somebody says, okay, what were you doing on the morning of the 15th? Oh, well, let's see. I got out of the left side of the bed. I think I went to brush my teeth next. I don't know which toothpaste I was using. At this point, the judge is going to say, wait a minute, get with it. That's not what we're asking. We want to know, were you in the vicinity of the corpse? See, even there, the whole truth doesn't mean the whole truth, does it? It means the whole relevant truth. Right, Counselor?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thanks for that explanation.
But you see, this operates at many different levels. And it doesn't mean that people are lying. It doesn't mean everybody's lying all the time. But it also doesn't excuse us from deliberately lying to people. I mean, I know that in many contexts, for example, in a doctor-patient relationship or nurse-patient relationship, perhaps more frequently, in a hospital or especially in a mental institution, the people caring for the ill get used to humoring them. And they'll tell them all kinds of stories in order to get them to do this or that. I'm not saying that's right. As a matter of fact, I'd say they're lying. But what are you supposed to do? See that? But that's why people say everybody lies, or there's many times you have to lie. No, actually, I would say no one is ever allowed to lie. Never. Because by its very essence, it's an anti-communicative communication. By its very essence, it's a perversion of the use of our faculty of communication. Now, clearly we find ourselves sometimes in difficult circumstances. How do you deal with those circumstances? And that's where they've developed the theory of various forms of mental reservation. Now, not everything that we say is a lie. Remember, the measure is what's in the mind. So if I say that that thing over there is a telephone, and I believe it's a telephone, and it is a telephone, I've spoken the truth. If I say that it's a mongoose, but it's really a telephone, I've told a lie. But if I see it, let's say I'm hallucinating, and I see it as a mongoose and tell you that it is a telephone, I've also lied. But if I tell you it's a mongoose and I see it as a mongoose and it's a telephone, I told you the truth. Not the logical truth, but the moral truth. So we understand those distinctions. That's not that hard. What we're concerned with is, when can a person say something contrary to that which he himself believes? Can he ever do that? Of course, in the strict sense, the answer is never. You can't do it. Ethicians have attempted to work out a theory of how we can do this, how we can get through these circumstances. And part of it consists in this. We're always bound to tell the truth. That is, in the sense we're not permitted to tell a lie. But are you bound to tell every truth you know? Heaven forbid. And there are many truths you should never tell. Secrets, natural secrets, kept secrets, promised secrets, state secrets, things that just shouldn't be known, private information. So, yes, we're obligated to tell the truth, but we're not obligated to reveal everything that's in our mind. And in many instances, we are obligated not to reveal what is in our mind. So the practical problem is, how then can we operate, can we function without telling lies and still respect our obligation not to tell everything that's in our mind? There are certain things that you ought not tell children, right? There are certain things they ought not know by a certain age. There's certainly a professor is not supposed to go into a classroom and tell his students the answers to the questions, to the test before he gives them a test. This is where we come up with the notion of a mental reservation. In other words, some things are reserved to the mind. And a distinction is made between what is called a broad reservation as opposed to a strict reservation. In a broad reservation, basically what you say in response to somebody is something that is sufficiently ambiguous that in the context they could figure out what you're saying, but they may not. Now this is only permissible where the person, and here Grotius and Pufendorf are right, this only applies where the person has no right to the truth. If they have a right to the truth, you can't even use a broad mental reservation. So children ought not, for example, to be lying to their parents, and children ought not be using broad mental reservations with their parents. But remember, when you talk about a person, this is where it gets a little complicated. When you talk about a person having a right to the truth, it's a right to the truth within the context. For example, if your father is an alcoholic, he's your father, you ought not lie to him. You shouldn't use broad mental reservations with him. But if he's an alcoholic and he's drunk and he says, Jimmy, where's the shotgun? Okay, now what are you going to do? You see, in this context, although he does have authority over you, he doesn't have the right to use that authority because he's not coherent enough to do it. He could kill somebody. So in that case, a mental reservation on the part of the child in relation to the parent is licit. A broad mental reservation. He said, Johnny, where is the shotgun? Johnny says, I don't know. He doesn't know as far as he's concerned. That's all that he can say. We are often told of the example of, say, the Nazis come to the door of a Dutch family during the war and want to know, are you hiding any Jews up in your attic? And of course the proper answer is no, I'm not. And that's a broad mental reservation because clearly the Nazi has no right, even if they're the administrators and occupiers of the territory, they have no natural moral right for that information because they're about to commit murder in the name of it. So you have a perfect right to, I would say, to say, no, I don't have any Jews here, as far as you're concerned. But I do think you have a problem if they were to ask you, where is so-and-so, and you were to say, he went 25 miles over to another town and you'll find him at a gas station in the center of town. Because you see, that isn't a broad mental reservation, that's a strict reservation. There's no way on earth they're going to know that this is only in your mind and that it's not, you're not telling them at all the truth. Because you have filled out such detail that it is a very convincing, there's no room for ambiguity, you see. This relies upon a certain degree of ambiguity. One has to remember, in a strict mental reservation, the truth is only in your own mind. There's no way the other person could know it. You've made up a cock and bull story. With a broad mental reservation, what you tell them is true as far as it goes. And they, if they have their wits about them, should understand in the context what you are saying to them. So if you say, no, I don't have any Jews here, a Nazi certainly ought to understand what you're saying is, no, I don't have any as far as you're concerned. He may not be able to discern that, but he knows that's a possibility. You're not responsible if the person hearing you is exceedingly dumb. So what you're really doing is expressing an ambiguous meaning. The truth is in your mind, and the truth is in your expression. They say, are there any Jews here? You say no. Because it is the truth in your expression as far as they are concerned. They have no right to that truth. And they know they don't. Or they ought to know they don't. But it would be quite another thing, as I say, if you make up a very detailed story, which really makes it impossible for them to know. A strict mental reservation, the truth is only in your mind, and it's not in your expression at all. If the statement that you make in no way expresses your mind, then it's simply a lie. And that's why I say, if you tell them so-and-so is 5 miles away in another town by a gas station, that's not in your mind in any way, shape, or manner. What you are expressing is not what is in your mind. But if I simply say, no, there's nobody here like that, then it is in your mind, that there's nobody here like that as far as you have a right to know. And they ought to realize that.
Professor?
Yes.
Why does a broad mental reservation permit one to lie?
Because it isn't a lie.
No, but it is a lie, because if the authorities, the Nazis, in their example, show up at your door and they ask you if you're hiding anyone, and you tell them no, and you
Yeah.
are,
Right.
they don't have a right to that information.
That's correct.
But you are lying. I mean, you're telling a falsehood.
You,
Why, I understand you
Yeah.
having the right to tell them outright that they don't have the right to that information.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to divulge.
no, everybody understands that. But this is why, this is not what Pufendorf would say. Pufendorf would say you can make up any old story that you want. What you are simply saying, they ask you, is this person here? And you say, no. You are stating what is in your mind, namely, no such person here is here as far as you are concerned, because you have no right to this information. And you ought to know it. And they ought to be able to understand that that's a real possible meaning of what you've said. What you have said is ambiguous. It's definitively ambiguous, but it's ambiguous because it could have more than one meaning, and in the context, remember the Sprachspielen, in the context of the language game, they know darn well that any decent person isn't going to tell them yes.
Well, I think you're being Machiavellian, because
Machiavelli would say the end justifies the means, but you have to listen very carefully to what you're saying. Look, it's not essentially different than when the person, I know the gravity of the situation makes it seem like it is. How is it different, though, than when you meet somebody walking across the field and they say, how are you today? And you say, fine. You just told a lie. No, you meant fine in terms of the context in which we are communicating. The context in which we are communicating, you don't want to know every last detail of my health. In fact, you don't even have a right to it. I might have terminal cancer. I'm not obliged to tell you that, and you know that. And the Nazis got the same problem.
but to me, there's a qualitative difference between, like, for instance, my colleague may not have a right to know how much I earn. And they come up to me and ask me, how much are you making? Now, because they don't have a right to that information, you're saying that I can tell them anything?
No, that's what Grotius would say. That's what Pufendorf would say. That's what I'm not saying. You can't make up a cock and bull story. If they ask you how much you're earning, you either, as you said, you could just say, I can't tell you. I mean, obviously, they know you know how much you're earning. So you're in a situation in that context where you basically have to tell them, I'm not going to tell you.
Just say not enough.
Yeah.
Enough to make a living.
I mean,
But in the Nazi example, by
Yeah.
saying no,
Mhm.
I mean,
That's no
both can
different.
surmise that they can easily interpret that as being a direct answer to their direct question.
That's correct, but they also could interpret it rightly as being a refusal to answer the question. You may get shot for saying no, but it's not essentially different than the person who says, I'm fine. When they ask you, how are you feeling today? I'm fine. That's also a lie by your definition, but it isn't in the context of human communication.
From the religious point of view, when you're on your judgment day,
You're not going to get to lie there.
how do you explain?
No mental
God?
reservations.
Will that be an issue or?
No, it's not an issue because God knows what's in your mind. He knows you better than you know yourself, so you don't have to worry about communicating. You're going to get read, for better or for worse. Mental reservations, even in a court of law, may be allowed if there is a sufficiently serious reason. You may risk getting thrown in jail for it. But if there is an absolutely sufficient reason, it has to be a reason so strong that the right of the court is delegitimized. Life can be complicated. Life can be difficult. You notice when somebody takes an oath to enter the United States military, what are you required to say, George?
Without any purpose of mental reservation or mental reservation.
Any purpose of evasion or mental reservation. The U.S. Army figured that one out. So what's your option?
Do it or don't do it.
Yes, it is. Do it or don't do it. If you've got a mental reservation, don't take the oath. That's what they're saying. And that's an alternative.
I remember G. Gordon Liddy, this was at his, I believe it was the Senate hearing, or it was at his trial, and he was to be sworn, and he simply refused to testify. He would not swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
Good for him.
I don't know what happened.
But would we also judge these things based on what we learned before about object and circumstance? When, I mean, there are circumstances here where
The kind of circumstance you're looking at, though, it's not a question of making a lie okay.
Right, no.
Yeah, we're not going to do that. But the circumstances have to do with the legitimacy of the authority of the person asking the question. If they have no right to ask the question, regardless of what office they hold, because the question by its nature, according to natural law, ought not be asked, then you can use a broad mental reservation in responding, but not a strict one, not a strict one. Pufendorf allows a strict mental reservation. Joe, you're thinking.
To revert back to the Nazi example, when the interrogator says, are you harboring any Jews? And the homeowner has, say, 3 or 4 Jews in his basement, and he says no, I think he would be telling the truth, because what the interrogator really means is, are you harboring any Jews that the government has a right to execute? You're saying no, because the government has no right to execute.
Well, all right, that might be another way to put it, but it still amounts to the point that you can use a broad mental reservation when you're dealing with someone who has no right to the truth, or as Wittgenstein would say, doesn't really expect the truth. They're not expecting you to say it. It's a social convenience. And I might add, as a matter of general demeanor, we ought to always tell the truth. This is not a matter of trying to find ways to go through your life every day misleading everyone. This is a matter of, in general, everything that we say ought to be what is in our mind. But bearing in mind what Wittgenstein points out about the complexity of social interaction. There are many things that we don't expect to know. We ought to be careful about what kind of questions we ask. We ought not be busybodies. You shouldn't be asking the CIA agent that lives next to you about government secrets. And you know you're not going to get straight answers from him, don't you? You don't expect it. You don't deserve it, and you're not going to get it. It is the only difference here between the broad and strict mental reservation is, first of all, you shouldn't be using even broad ones unless you have very good reason for it. And secondly, it's a problem for the first person speaking. When somebody asks you a question that they have no right to, then you have to be a little careful how you answer so that you step through the tulips, as it were, and not commit a strict mental reservation in the process. It does take a degree of cleverness in some instances. Krista.
I'm a little hung up on how we're defining who has a right to know. How do you determine that?
Well, Okay, right to know, remember, rights flow from obligations. A judge has an obligation to find the truth on behalf of society in a criminal or civil case. And because they have an obligation and are charged by society to find that truth, they have a right to demand that you tell the truth. But their right does not transcend natural law. If it's something that is of such gravity that it would conflict with the, if, for example, you knew a state secret that was essential to the survival of the nation, then the judge who's demanding that you tell the whole truth at that moment, you probably ought to say, I can't tell you, it's national security, but you can get in a position where you can't even tell them that, and that's where you might have to make a broad mental reservation, even in the face of a judge.
But I think the best way is not to put yourself into the situation that you have to be prepared for lying. So I wouldn't save anyone if authorities chasing that someone, and I don't know what kind of reason they have. Maybe they did some crime or something.
There again, we go through life trying to avoid problems, but that doesn't mean we should be moral cowards in the process.
Right. We're getting more and more of those kind of questions, like in China, when they say to a woman, "Are you pregnant again?"
Yeah, and what is she forced to say?
She has to say no.
Exactly, even if she's pregnant, because they have no right to ask the question. And it's a broad mental reservation. They ought to well understand she is not obligated to answer that, and she's saying no as far as you commie dictators are concerned.
But at least that's
The-
her baby.
This
And
is-
she can question, why I have to hide this people or that people or this person. I don't know what crime they committed. So if I do hide them because somebody is chasing them,
Well, it's analogous to hiding the Jew in your basement.
yeah, well, maybe they.
And you have a
some
moral,
crime.
you have in fact a moral obligation to protect that innocent person, just as you have a moral obligation to protect the innocent child in your womb.
If they're innocent.
I think the children in the womb are
No, I'm not
innocent.
talking about
Oh.
children, but what we're hiding are
I know some
another
kids are
person.
bad, but not the, you got Bart Simpson that you're about to hatch. No, I know you meant something else. But again, the point is, if you're hiding them, the presumption is you're doing it because you do not have an obligation to hand them over to the authorities. If you're hiding Jesse James in your basement, then you certainly don't have the natural right to refuse to tell them. See, it depends on the facts of the case. And as an individual, you have to make a judgment. Now, another topic that's analogous to this, that falls under the same heading, in a way, has to do with the keeping of secrets. We are obliged to keep secrets. This has to do with communication. See, that's the general heading here. There are secrets that can be a natural secret. For example, something that would be very harmful to your neighbor, you found out about him, the whole town doesn't know it. You don't have a right to say, hey, I found out this person has this horrible criminal background, I'm going to tell the whole town. Now, you might have an obligation if they are a sex offender and they're in your neighborhood, you've got a lot of children around, but assuming that this is not something that would be of that type, then this is what we call a natural secret. And it's nobody else's business, and you are obliged morally not to start gossiping about them. You can have a promise secret. That is where somebody says, I'll tell you this if you promise not to tell anybody. If you agree, you're bound by it. That's where well, there's two kinds. You can, that would be where you make a pact ahead of time that you're not going to tell anybody. The other thing is where they tell you and then you promise voluntarily you won't tell anybody. You're bound by that too. Now, there are some limitations on secret keeping. This gets really complex more than we have time to go in here tonight. But you can terminate a secret if, for example, it becomes known. I remember a friend of mine, when I was about 18, told me that his father had had a previous wife who died, and he didn't want anybody to know it. So I said, okay, I'll never tell anybody. I never did. When we were about 60 years old, we had a party, and he's all of a sudden telling everybody at the party. I suddenly realized, gee, I guess I'm not bound by that secret anymore, am I? But I didn't tell anybody for, 50 years. And that's the way a secret is supposed to be. So if somebody's already let it out. Also, you may be able, depends on the circumstances, to terminate a secret if keeping it would entail grave injury to yourself, or to the person the secret is the subject of, or to some third person, or to church, or to state. That can terminate a secret in some context. I'm not trying to lay down every point here. There are some kinds of secrets that are bound by the very nature of the relationship. For example, a professional relationship between a client and an attorney, or the relationship between a priest and penitent. Now, because of the very grave importance to society to maintain professional secrets, it becomes extremely difficult to know whenever that secret could be violated. I'm thinking particularly in the case of the lawyer. As far as the relationship of the priest and penitent, the one time that the secret can be broken is never. That's why the seal of the confessional is absolute. There's never an excuse for any priest ever, ever, ever breaking it, even if you're going to boil him in oil, and a few have been. When you make a promise to somebody, that's another line of communication, which if you promise that you're going to do something, you are morally obliged to do it because you have to be faithful to your own word. So promises, analogously, we're talking about means of communication, whether it be telling truth or lies or secrets or promises that are made. I mean, I consider the promises that politicians make before they get elected. I suppose many of them would say, well, you didn't expect me to keep it anyway, did you? After all, I'm only a politician. Don't expect me to have a soul. But on the other hand, you are obligated. Well, I've met some that did have souls. Not going to say how many, but we are obligated by our promises. Yes, absolutely. Now, of course, politicians will always say, well, I made that promise before I got into office and found out how complicated things were. And then all of a sudden I found, well, I can't keep the promise anymore. Well, sometimes that may be valid.
They are sufficiently ambiguous.
When they make the promise. Well, I mean, look, it's like, I'm dating myself a little, but when John F. Kennedy was running for the White House in 1960, there was a big missile gap. You remember? No, I know you don't all remember. But all of a sudden, when he became president, he found out there wasn't a missile gap. So anything that he said pertaining to it, of course, was no longer operative, not because he had made a promise he was breaking, but he simply found out after the fact that the basis for the promise was non-existent. So these are the complexities you get into, but all of this arises within the context of human ability to communicate. And it is extremely complex. That's why I would hope you would remember the insight given us by Ludwig Wittgenstein that we are engaged in kind of language games. There are rules. It is possible to tell a lie, and a liar knows when he's telling one. It's possible in some cases for people to tell lies even when they know they're not deceiving anyone. How is that possible? Well, a litigant in a divorce case, everybody on both sides know that they're lying, but they still have to tell the lie in order to maintain their legal purpose. It's still a lie, though. It's still morally wrong, even though they know they're not deceiving. So we have an obligation to speak the truth. And of course, the moral stance is that we ought always, wherever it is humanly possible, to speak the truth. But even so, when you speak the truth, there are times that there are things you don't say because you are obligated, it isn't prudent to say every aspect of the truth. You state 80% of it. The other 20% you reserve. That's a mental reservation because it's not appropriate to the context. It didn't need to be said. I'm sure there are things that Rick Santorum said in the last week he wished he hadn't said and didn't have to say. It wouldn't have been immoral not to have said them. See, there again, the politician can get himself in trouble by speaking the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, even to the detriment of his candidacy when he doesn't need to, and prudence would say not to. And yet he could still be true to his principles. This is how complex it is. I mean, every time we open our mouths, how many times do we open our mouths and say something we wish we hadn't said? We do it all the time. And then we wind up having to backpedal and explain what we were saying. And that's how you get into the situation where you suddenly ask yourself, am I lying? Is this okay to say it this way? You're engaged in that game. But of course it has moral qualities to it. So we have to, as we get more mature in life, we're supposed to learn a bit better how to do this. Nobody gets up in the morning, at least most people don't unless they're used car salesmen, saying, I'm going to lie to everybody I meet. We don't intend that. What happens is we say we get caught in a lie. What happens is we get caught in a circumstance where we are very much tempted to lie. And in some cases, I suppose if we were quick-witted enough, we might not have to cross the Rubicon on that. And sometimes we are forced simply, if we're not going to lie, to face the consequences. Sometimes people are clever enough to avoid the circumstance. Nobody's going to guarantee that you're always going to be able to work your way through a problem without having to make a moral decision. That's part of living. That's what ethics is about, right? We don't wake up in the morning thinking, gee, I want to commit this many moral faults. But by the time we go to bed at night, the story may be different, right? Being human and all that. Okay, anything else about sister?
Would it be safe, thinking religiously now, or that a broad reservation need not be a matter of confession? Can you take that step as opposed to maybe a strict one?
If you're talking about the sacrament of penance, the problem is that you are speaking to someone who's acting in the place of God. This is not the place for hiding things. If it is a matter of something, you see, either you think you are obliged to say something or not. If you do not think you are obliged to say it, then you need not say it.
Well, that's good information, but my question was really on the other slant. If I respond to somebody ambiguously about some issue, now I go to confession. Do I have to tell the priest that I had a broad mental reservation?
No, because it was presumably licit for you to have done that.
Okay, that's my point.
Yeah, there's nothing, you're only obliged to confess what you judge to have been immoral, and the whole point of the broad mental reservation is if it is properly used, it's not immoral.
Okay.
But, it's like anything else in ethics. We can always cheat. We can always play games. But we don't deceive God. We don't deceive ourselves. So as long as we're being straight with ourselves and straight with God, where's the problem?
So in that other sense, then a strict reservation would be immoral, or not?
A strict mental reservation is a lie.
That's a strict,
Yeah.
that's a lie.
Let me give you another example. Let's say a priest has just heard somebody's confession on a deathbed. And as he's coming out, somebody says, well, did he take care of it all? What is the priest supposed to say? No, he refused to go. He can't say that. Is he supposed to say, well, yes, he did take care of it all? He can't really say that either. I mean, all he can say is something like, everything has been taken care of. I mean, and the rest of it isn't your business, in other words. And it's understood it's not your business. You never should ask such a stupid question in the first place. And that's what it's about. But he certainly is not obligated by the circumstance to blurt out something that indicates what the penitent did. And everybody understands that. And that, of course, is exactly the basis for the broad mental reservation. There are things that's nobody's business. And therefore, you have a right to answer them in such a way. I mean, if you want, you can just say it's none of your blankety-blank business. That's okay. But of course, this isn't always possible. It isn't always, if you have a police authority asking you a question, that probably isn't the best way to respond.
We had a thing in the convent all the time that said you could never ask a direct personal question. So the slang for it was no DBQs. Couldn't ask a direct personal question.
Right, because
So that eliminated all that.
that's right. And the problem we have in society is many people ask questions they have no right to ask. If again, we're talking about ethics, don't be a busybody. Don't ask people things that they can't answer or ought not be obligated to answer.
So in early Christianity, when Christians were persecuted, were they allowed to say, no, I have not denied the fact that they were Christians?
No, they couldn't. That was called apostasy.
If you deny me before men.
Pardon me?
If you deny me before men.
Yeah, yeah.
Couldn't they use,
No, you can. What mental reservation are you going to use? Are you a Christian? No, I'm not. Where's the ambiguity in that?
They could hide from the authorities or something.
they knew they would die?
Yes, that was called martyrdom.
Exactly.
That was a way to go to heaven real fast. It was a good ticket. I mean, what more could you ask for? The problem you have there is a question of the theological obligation of the Christian to confess his faith. As you just said, those who deny me before men, I will deny before the Father in heaven. So Christ had already put that obligation upon Christians. Nobody ever said being a Christian was supposed to be easy.
Okay, so from the Christian point of view.
Yeah.
Okay,
The obligation.
I understand that.
There's a
But
special obligation.
From philosophy point of view, philosophical point of view, would that, if we have
From a
like
ph-
to cover up for someone that we have, if I
Yeah.
have someone in my house that
Right.
others are hunting.
The problem is the Christian has a special obligation to answer that kind of question. So the philosophy can't address that at all. That's not a philosophical issue. That's a theological issue. There is an obligation that attends to the person who has committed himself to Christianity, which does not arise within a philosophical context.
But the point is that broad mental reservation would apply in that case.
No, absolutely not.
Why not?
Because you, understanding the Christian theology, you are not permitted to use a broad mental reservation in that case.
But the theological aspects would impinge on one's one
Yes.
being allowed to answer in one way or another, but from the philosophical point of view, from the point of view of today's class,
Yeah.
the broad mental reservation would apply in that case, because we're assuming these authorities don't have the right to ask someone about their private creed.
The problem is you can't say, look, I'm a Christian here, and I know what my obligations are, but right now I'm only going to operate as a philosopher, because as a philosopher, I won't have to deal with those nasty lions. But as a Christian, I might have to.
So
No.
what you're implying then is that being a Christian nullifies
No, it gives you a
broad mental reservation
it gives
in some
you
case.
it gives you a special obligation that does not allow you to use the broad mental reservation.
So they can be in conflict.
Well, it's not a conflict. It's simply that there are cases where you're allowed to use it, but there are cases where you're forbidden to use it. Certainly, the obligation of a jurist to tell the truth is going to be more serious in a juridical context than it would be for somebody who's just brought in as an ordinary witness. But I'm not trying to say that in some cases it's okay, in other cases it's not. The difficulty is that here you have a special theological obligation that is based on anyone who, as a unified being, is a philosopher who happens also to be a Christian. And as one being, you have an obligation that flows from the unity of your being, which is primarily subordinated to your Christianity. You can't just say, well, as a philosopher, I don't know anything about this. Because you do know something about it if you're a Christian. You have an obligation that flows from your Christianity. You can't split yourself into two beings. This is analogous to the Catholic who says, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I'm in the state legislature. I have to act on behalf of what the people want. It's something analogous to that. Okay, we have to quit, folks, for tonight.
What about all those desks that have two drawers, but when you pull them out,
Still
it's one?
say you
Is the desk lying to us? Sound production copyright, Olteen Library Services, 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com